In the winter of 1932, a family in rural Oklahoma fed 6 children on $11 for an entire month. Not $11 a week. $11 for 30 days. The mother kept a ledger. Dried beans appeared on the page 41 times. Cornmeal appeared 38 times. Lard appeared on nearly every line. The Great Depression is remembered through photographs, the bread lines, the Dust Bowl, the hollow-eyed faces that Dorothea Lange captured in migrant camps across California. What the photographs do not show is the kitchen. The particular ingenuity of women who had almost nothing and produced meals from it with a consistency and a dignity that never made the front page. The specific foods they used, the combinations they relied on, and the techniques they developed are almost entirely gone from the American table today. Most people who know Depression-era food know it in outline. Beans, bread, hard times. What most people miss is the specific chemistry of survival, the way that lard and cornmeal and dried legumes combined correctly delivered enough protein, fat, and caloric density to sustain human life through near-total privation. The word that matters most before this list is finished is lard. Not as a punchline, not as a symbol of dietary ignorance, but as the single most important ingredient in the Depression-era kitchen, and one that modern science has had to quietly and reluctantly reassess. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 things poor Americans in the 1930s actually ate when they had almost nothing. Number 25. Dandelion greens. Before the grocery store was a place people went every week, the yard and the roadside were part of the food supply. Dandelion greens, pulled from lawns and field edges in early spring, were one of the first free foods available after a hard winter. Mothers who had stretched the bean supply through February watched for the yellow flowers, the way other people watched for a paycheck. The leaves were eaten in salads, dressed with hot bacon grease and a splash of vinegar. That cooking technique did something chemically important. The fat made the fat-soluble vitamins in the greens available for absorption. Nutritionists now know that dandelion greens contain more beta-carotene than carrots and more calcium per serving than milk. The women who pulled them from the yard in 1932 knew none of that. They knew they were free, they were there, and the children needed to eat something green. Number 24. Grease bread. There are foods on this list that require context before a modern reader can understand them. Grease bread is not one of them. A slice of white bread or cornbread, spread with lard and sprinkled with salt. For millions of families across the rural South, the Midwest, and the mining communities of Appalachia, grease bread was not a snack. It was a meal. The lard provided fat calories in a concentrated form that kept hunger at bay for hours in a way that plain bread could not. Children who grew up in the Depression mentioned grease bread with a consistency that suggests it appeared at tables across the country, with a frequency that has never been adequately acknowledged. A pound of lard ran about 5 cents in 1933. Number 23. Milk gravy over biscuits. White gravy made from lard, flour, and whatever milk was available, poured thick over split biscuits made from flour and lard, with no butter and no eggs. This was the breakfast that appeared on tables across the South and Midwest on more Depression mornings than almost any other single dish. A family that had flour, lard, salt, and a quart of milk could produce a hot breakfast for 6 people for under 20 cents. Families who could not afford milk made the gravy with water and called it pourdu. It was thinner and less satisfying, but it was hot, it filled the plate, and it asked very little of a pantry that had very little to give. Number 22. Fried cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was boiled in water until thick, poured into a loaf pan, and left overnight to set firm. The next morning, the set mush was sliced into thick rectangles and fried in lard in a cast-iron skillet until each side turned golden and crisp. What emerged from the pan bore almost no resemblance to the soft porridge it had been the night before. The exterior was crackling and caramelized. The interior was dense and warm. Drizzled with molasses, or eaten plain alongside a fried egg when eggs were available, fried mush was the Depression breakfast that made something from almost nothing. A 10-pound sack of cornmeal cost about 15 cents in 1931 and produced enough mush to feed a family of 5 for a week of breakfasts. Number 21. Beans and fatback. A pot of dried beans simmered all day with a piece of fatback roughly the size of a fist was the foundational meal of the Depression-era kitchen. Not a side dish, the meal itself. Fatback was the cheapest cut in the pork case and contributed rendered lard to the pot liquor, a smoky depth of flavor to the broth, and enough caloric density to make a bowl of beans genuinely sustaining. The pot liquor, the dark, fatty, intensely savory liquid that accumulated in the bottom of the pot over hours of slow cooking, was not discarded. Cornbread was baked specifically to be broken into it and eaten with a spoon. Children in Appalachian homes were taught that the pot liquor was the best part. They were right, and they were also receiving the minerals and fat-soluble nutrients that had leached from the beans and the pork during the long simmer. Dried pinto beans cost 8 cents a pound in 1932. Number 20. Potato soup with nothing in it. 5 potatoes, 1 onion, water. Salt. Diced potatoes and sliced onion were simmered until soft. Some of the potatoes were mashed directly in the pot to thicken the broth into something that felt like a cream soup. A splash of canned evaporated milk and a knob of lard turned it genuinely creamy if they were available. Without those additions, it was thinner, plainer, and still eaten without complaint, because the alternative was nothing. Oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s include descriptions of this soup from families across 20 states. The specific memory that appears most often is not the taste of the soup itself. It is the smell of the onion cooking in the pot, and the way it made the kitchen feel, briefly, like everything was going to be all right. Number 19. Cornbread and milk. A pan of cornbread crumbled into a glass of cold milk and eaten with a spoon was the unofficial supper of children across the rural South and Midwest on nights when there was nothing else to cook and no energy left to cook it. Mothers who had spent a day doing laundry or standing in a relief line came home to kitchens where the cornmeal and the milk were the only things still in the house. The cornbread swelled in the cold milk and softened to the texture of a loose porridge. Adults who grew up during the Depression and were interviewed decades later mentioned this dish not with shame, but with something closer to fondness. The specific fondness that attaches to memories of things that were hard and simple and somehow survived. Number 18. Drippings on toast. The can of drippings that sat on the back of every Depression-era stove was one of the most important objects in the house. Every time fat was rendered from bacon or salt pork, the liquid drippings went into the can. Every time a piece of meat was fried, whatever remained in the skillet went in. Over days and weeks, the can accumulated a layered, complex fat that carried the flavor of everything that had been cooked in it. Spread on toasted bread and eaten hot, this was the meal that appeared when everything else was gone. It was also the base from which every other preparation derived its depth. Lard was the neutral fat. Drippings were the flavored fat. A kitchen that kept both and used both carefully ate better than its circumstances suggested it should. First pattern break. Here is what the Depression-era kitchen understood that the modern kitchen has almost entirely forgotten. Fat was not the enemy. Fat was the budget. Calories percent was the metric that Depression-era mothers were optimizing without knowing the language for it. And lard won that calculation so decisively that the comparison is almost embarrassing. A pound of lard in 1932 delivered roughly 3,500 calories and cost about 5 cents. A pound of butter delivered roughly the same calories and cost 4 times as much. Modern nutrition research has had to do a certain amount of quiet backtracking on this subject. The Women's Health Initiative, one of the largest dietary studies ever conducted, found no significant association between saturated fat consumption and cardiovascular disease outcomes. The specific saturated fat in lard, oleic acid, and palmitic acid in roughly equal proportion has been reassessed repeatedly over the past 20 years in ways that have made the original condemnation increasingly difficult to sustain. The lard in every recipe on this list was not a concession to poverty. It was the ingredient that made survival possible. Number 17. Vegetable soup from the garden. Whatever the garden produced, whatever was going soft in the root cellar, whatever vegetable had reached the end of its useful life went into the soup pot on Thursday or Friday, the days when the grocery money had been tallied and spent, and the next week had not yet started. Carrots going limp, a potato with eyes sprouting, half a cabbage, an onion starting to dry. All of it went into the pot, covered with water, and simmered for an hour with salt. The soup tasted different because the garden produced differently each week. Families who kept a kitchen garden through the Depression ate better than families who did not, and the soup pot was the primary mechanism by which the garden's marginal produce was converted into something nourishing rather than discarded. Number 16. Peanut butter bread. Peanut butter was introduced to the American mass market in the 1920s, and by the time the Depression arrived, it had become one of the cheapest sources of concentrated protein and fat available. A jar cost about 14 cents in 1933, and it delivered nearly 3,000 calories. Spread thick on slices of white bread, peanut butter appeared at Depression-era tables as a meal at least as often as it appeared as a sandwich filling. The combination of bread and peanut butter delivered carbohydrate, fat, and protein in a ratio that was, by accident, genuinely sound for a child in a caloric deficit. The Depression-era mother who put it on the table did not know the ratio. She knew it was filling, and she could afford it. Number 15. Macaroni and tomatoes. This is not macaroni and cheese. It is not pasta with marinara. Cooked elbow macaroni was returned to the pot with a can of whole-peeled tomatoes broken apart by hand, salt and pepper, and a spoonful of lard or bacon drippings. The tomatoes coated the macaroni in an acidic, slightly sweet sauce that was nothing like anything from a restaurant. A can of tomatoes cost about 10 cents in 1934. A box of macaroni was 8 cents. This fed 4 people, with enough left for lunch the next day when the sauce had soaked into the pasta. Every Southern grandmother made this. Church cookbooks from Georgia to Missouri listed it without full ingredients because everyone already knew. Today, it has been replaced so completely that the original version has essentially vanished, and almost no one has noticed what went with it. Number 14. Fried salt pork with milk gravy. A thick slice of salt pork, rinsed and fried in a dry skillet until the fat rendered and the exterior turned brown and slightly crisp. Salt pork ran about 8 cents a pound. The drippings that accumulated went directly into the gravy. A spoonful of flour stirred into the fat until it turned the color of a paper bag. Then milk poured in slowly until it came to a thick simmer. The gravy went over the pork, over biscuits, over whatever starch was on the plate. Together, the combination delivered the fat and protein that a body doing physical work required, for a total cost that would not tax a household living on $4 a week for food. Number 13. Mush with molasses. Cornmeal boiled in water until it thickened to a porridge, served in a bowl with a dark pour of sorghum molasses across the top, was the breakfast and sometimes the supper of families who had cornmeal and molasses and not much else. Sorghum molasses cost about 25 cents a gallon in 1932, cheap enough to buy in quantity. The flavor was dark and slightly bitter, and it cut through the bland starchiness of the plain mush in a way that made the combination, if not precisely delicious, at least tolerable in the way that things eaten out of necessity are tolerable when they are warm and there is enough of them. Children who ate this for breakfast on cold mornings and were asked decades later to describe it sometimes used the word comforting without apparent irony. Number 12. Depression cake. A chocolate cake made with no eggs, no butter, and no milk. 1½ cups of flour, 1 cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons of cocoa powder, 1 teaspoon each of baking soda and salt, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 6 tablespoons of melted lard, 1 tablespoon of white vinegar, and 1 cup of cold water. Mixed directly in the baking pan. Baked at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. The baking soda reacted with the vinegar to provide the leavening that eggs would normally supply. The lard provided the fat that butter would normally supply. What came out of the oven was a moist, dark, genuinely good chocolate cake. Mothers who baked it for their children's birthdays during the Depression were not making a substitute. They were making a cake, and the children at the table did not know the difference. Second pattern break. Here is something that the history of Depression-era eating reveals about poverty and nutritional knowledge that should be more widely understood. The families who ate the best during the Depression were not the families with the most money. They were the families with the most knowledge, specifically the knowledge of how to combine cheap ingredients in ways that delivered complete nutrition. Beans and cornbread together form a complete protein, providing all 9 essential amino acids that neither ingredient provides alone. This is not a coincidence. Southern and Appalachian cooking traditions had developed this combination over generations before any nutritionist had a name for complete proteins. And the families who inherited those traditions ate through the Depression with better nutritional outcomes than families who had lost the knowledge and depended on white bread and sugar for their calories. The pot liquor from slow-cooked beans and greens delivered minerals in a bioavailable form that no supplement of the era could match. The women who saved that liquid in a jar and served it to their children were not just being economical. They were preserving the most nutritionally concentrated part of what they had cooked. They did not need a laboratory to tell them that. They could see it working in the children who drank it regularly. Number 11. Potato cakes. Leftover mashed potatoes, cold from the night before, combined with a small amount of flour and a spoonful of lard, formed into flat rounds and fried in a skillet until golden and crisp on both sides. Potato cakes required the same ingredients as everything else on this list and made something new from what was already there. A potato that had been a side dish the previous evening became the centerpiece of the next morning's breakfast. The exterior crisped in the hot fat and took on a slightly nutty flavor from the browning. The interior stayed soft and yielding. This was the application of the Depression-era principle that nothing which could be eaten tomorrow should be discarded today. Number 10. Crackers and milk. A box of saltines crumbled into a glass of cold milk and eaten with a spoon was the unofficial last meal of the day for children across the rural South and Midwest on nights when the kitchen was cold and the mother was too tired to cook. A box of saltines cost about a dime. The ritual of it mattered as much as the food itself. The crackers went in first, the milk came after. You waited for the crackers to soften just enough to hold their shape before they dissolved entirely, and then ate quickly. There was a specific pleasure in timing this correctly that children who grew up doing it remembered into old age, with a precision that suggests it was one of the more reliable small comforts of a childhood defined by unreliable large ones. Number 9. Fried green tomatoes. Unripe tomatoes pulled from the garden before the first frost, sliced thick, dredged in seasoned cornmeal, and fried in lard in a cast-iron skillet until each side was golden and the tomato had softened through to a yielding, slightly tart center. Green tomatoes cost nothing because they came from a garden already there. The cornmeal cost almost nothing. What came out of the pan was genuinely delicious. The tartness of the unripe tomato played against the richness of the lard, and the slight crunch of the cornmeal crust, in a combination that did not taste like poverty and did not taste like compromise. It tasted like a skilled cook, making the most of what the garden still had to offer at the end of the season. Number 8. Bean soup with ham bone. After any meal that included cured ham, however small, the bone went into a pot of soaked dried navy beans or pinto beans, covered with cold water, and simmered for 3 to 4 hours until the beans turned creamy and the broth picked up every last trace of smoky, salty flavor from the bone. A ham bone was not a leftover in the Depression kitchen. It was the beginning of the next meal. A bag of dried navy beans cost 9 cents and produced enough soup to feed a family of 4 for 2 to 3 days, when stretched with bread or cornbread. Families who understood this arithmetic never threw away a bone. They planned around it. Sunday's ham became Monday's soup, which became Tuesday's second pot made from Monday's leftovers, with a little more water. Number 7. Wilted lettuce salad with hot bacon dressing. Leaf lettuce from the kitchen garden was placed in a bowl. In a skillet, 1 tablespoon of bacon drippings was heated with a splash of apple cider vinegar and a pinch of sugar until it bubbled and spat, then poured immediately over the raw lettuce. The heat wilted the leaves in seconds. The bacon fat and the vinegar combined into a glossy, rich, slightly sweet and sharp dressing that was unlike anything from a bottle because it was made hot and applied hot. The vinegar in the dressing made the iron in the lettuce more bioavailable by breaking down the phytic acid that would otherwise bind to it during digestion. Depression-era families did not know any of that. They knew it tasted good, it was free, and it was there. Number 6. Flour and water gravy. When there were no drippings in the pan, when there was no meat to produce any, flour and water gravy was the answer of last resort. A spoonful of lard melted in the skillet. A heaping spoonful of flour was stirred in until it turned the color of a manila envelope. Then water was poured in slowly while stirring, followed by salt and pepper. What thickened in the pan was not rich. It did not taste of much. It was hot, it covered the plate, and it made dry food easier to eat. Families who describe this in oral histories from the Depression era tell it with a matter-of-factness that is more affecting than any expression of hardship would be. It was simply what you made when you had flour, lard, water, and nothing else, and you needed something hot on the table before the children went to bed. Third pattern break. Here is something the food industry of the past 80 years has done with remarkable consistency and almost no acknowledgement. Every food on this list that was cheap, abundant, and nutritionally effective during the Depression was eventually replaced in the American diet by a more expensive, more processed, and in several cases, less nutritious alternative, and the replacement was accompanied by marketing that characterized the original as backward, unhealthy, or simply embarrassing. Lard was replaced by vegetable shortening and later by partially hydrogenated oils, both of which produce trans fats that are genuinely harmful in a way that lard is not and never was. Dried beans and legumes were replaced by canned products sold at several times the price, with added sodium and reduced cooking flexibility. Cornmeal was replaced by boxed cornbread mix with added sugar and preservatives. The Depression-era kitchen, which had developed an extraordinarily efficient food system from minimal inputs, was dismantled by post-war prosperity and replaced with a convenience economy that cost more, delivered less nutritional density, and erased the knowledge base that had made the original system work. Number 5. Boiled cabbage with lard. A head of cabbage cost about 3 cents at a roadside farm stand in the 1930s and fed a family of 4 as a main vegetable for 2 days. Boiled in salted water until the leaves turned silky and sweet, drained, and returned to the pot with a generous spoonful of lard stirred through. Not sophisticated, not pretty. Filling, warm, cheap, beyond calculation, and a delivery system for vitamin C, vitamin K, and folate in quantities that kept the symptoms of nutritional deficiency at bay in households where fresh produce was otherwise nearly absent. The combination with lard mattered here the same way it mattered with dandelion greens. The fat made the fat-soluble vitamins available for absorption. The Depression-era cook, who added a spoonful of drippings to the pot, was completing a nutritional transaction that the biology required and that she had learned from her mother without any understanding of the mechanism. Number 4. Corn pone. Corn pone was not cornbread. Cornbread had eggs, sometimes buttermilk, sometimes sugar. Corn pone had cornmeal, salt, water, and lard. The dough was formed by hand into small flattened rounds and fried in a skillet with a thin layer of lard until each side was golden and the center cooked through. Dense, slightly gritty, faintly sweet from the corn itself, and completely filling. A 10-pound sack of cornmeal cost 15 cents in 1932. From that sack, a mother could make corn pone for breakfast, crumbled cornbread for bean pot liquor at supper, and fried mush for the following morning, and still have cornmeal remaining. No grain in the American pantry has ever delivered more meals per penny. Number 3. Neck bones and greens. Pork neck bones cost 5 to 6 cents a pound in the 1930s at butcher shops that otherwise had no use for them. Dropped into a pot with a large bunch of collard greens, water to cover, salt, and red pepper, and simmered for 2 hours. The neck bones gave up everything they had. The gelatin from the cartilage, the fat from the marrow cavities, the concentrated savory depth of heavily worked muscle, all dissolved into the pot liquor that surrounded the wilting greens. The pot liquor, dark and glossy and intensely mineral, was the part of the meal that Appalachian and Southern families saved to ladle into cornbread. This was the complete and total extraction of value from 2 of the cheapest ingredients on the market, accomplished by time, low heat, and the knowledge of what those 2 things could do together. Number 2. Pinto beans and cornbread. Pinto beans soaked overnight, then simmered all day with salt and whatever pork was available, until the broth turned thick and brown and the beans turned creamy. Cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet, while the beans finished their last hour of cooking, was turned out onto a plate and broken into chunks to soak up the bean liquor. A bag of dried pinto beans cost 8 cents a pound throughout the 1930s. The cornmeal was already in the pantry. This was a complete meal for a family of 5 for under 30 cents. It was complete in the nutritional sense as well. The legume and the grain together forming the complete protein that neither provided alone. Families in the rural South, the Ozarks, and the Appalachian Highlands ate this combination 5 or 6 nights a week during the Depression, and sustained themselves on it through years that should have been impossible to survive. Number 1. Plain bean soup. Not a specific regional version with a memorable story attached. Just dried beans, whatever kind was in the pantry, or available from the relief agency, simmered in water with a halved onion, a bay leaf, and whatever scrap of cured pork was available, cooked until the beans broke down and thickened the water into something that could sustain human life through a long winter on almost nothing. This is the meal that appears in every oral history of Depression-era poverty. In Appalachian mining communities, where the company's store set the prices and the paycheck never quite reached the end of the week. In Dust Bowl farm towns, where the soil had blown away and the bank had taken the equipment. In urban tenements in Chicago and Cleveland, where men stood in bread lines and their wives stretched $1 of dried beans across 3 days of meals. In the sharecropper shacks of the Mississippi Delta, plain bean soup was what kept families alive when everything else was gone. A pound of dried beans cost 8 to 10 cents throughout the 1930s. It fed 6 people for 2 days. The pot liquor at the bottom of that bean pot was not discarded. It was saved and served the next morning over cornbread or drunk warm from a cup. Every drop of what had been extracted by the long simmer went into the bodies of the people who had made the meal, because waste was a luxury that the Depression kitchen could not afford, and the women running those kitchens had no intention of practicing. Make one of these this week. The cornbread and milk, the pinto beans, the tomato gravy over biscuits. Sit down at the table to eat it, not the couch, because the table was where these meals were made to be eaten, where the family came together around something that someone had worked to produce from almost nothing, and where the act of eating it was an act of dignity rather than defeat. Drop which one you are going to make in the comments. I want to know if the bean soup gets more love than the cornbread and pot liquor. And if your grandmother made any of these, tell me her name. She deserves to be remembered for what she knew.